I see that that pile of books has gratifyingly disappeared. I'm happy to sign them if you want me to, but I should warn you that the unsigned ones sell at a premium because they're so rare. Okay, good. This is my book is about science in the French Revolution, and it's got quite a lot of science in it, but it's also got a lot of stuff which I didn't know at all when I started, which is the way in which scientists actually were engaged both before and during the revolution in the political events, and the way in which many of them paid a very severe penalty, including the death penalty, for their engagement. And that's what I want to kind of talk through in this talk. This first the cover shows, it's a British cartoonist by Gilray, the famous 18th century cartoonist, which shows scientists being attacked by the mob and thrown to the mob, okay? They're trying to climb up this pillar to escape, but they're being thrown to the mob, and many of them indeed were thrown to the mob. And you can see in that image, you can see scientific instruments coming down. You see a balloon in the background. Of course, it was the age of ballooning. You see some surveying tools, and it was, as we'll see, it was the age of the Great Survey of France. And so that's the theme of the book. Now, in fact, the first time I went to Paris, I start the book by saying the first time I went to Paris very coincidentally, was in May 1968. And I was on my way to the Pyrenees, where I then spent many years going every summer and working on the genetics of snails. As I often say, I'm one of the world's top 6 experts on the genetics of snails, and the other 5 agree. That's no longer true. I don't think there's 6 of us left anymore. Probably the other 2 agree now. But I was on my way down there, and I'd never been to Paris before, and I'd come from Edinburgh. We're talking 1968, which in Edinburgh was 1958, effectively. And I got to the Gare du Nord and was amazed by the bright sunlight and the busyness of the scene. Got on the train, got on the metro to get to the station to go down to the south. And when I was on the train, metro train, I noticed an odd scent. And I thought it was a perfume. It was pungent. It wasn't unpleasant. And it wasn't until I opened the newspapers the next day that, in fact, I discovered it was tear gas seeping into the metro from the riots which had started on that day or the day before, just above. So that was my introduction to France. Here we have the famous image, sur les pavés la plage, under the cobblestones of the beach. Well, they pulled up plenty of cobblestones, but they didn't find the beach, I'm afraid. And that always reminds me of Marx's great statement that history always repeats itself. The first time as tragedy, and the second time as farce. And the farce, I think, was the 68 revolution, which really went nowhere, except it generated lots of hippies, most of whom are now my age, and are still grumbling about revolution. But the tragedy, if it was it, and it was a tragedy in many ways, was the French Revolution itself in 1789 and the great disasters and wars which followed it. Okay. And many of those, as I've said, many of the triumphs and the tragedies of the revolution were motivated by science and by scientists. In fact, the very moment of the revolution is every Frenchman knows is called the tennis court oath, and this is a painting by the French painter David of a gentleman with white hair standing and addressing the crowd. And this was the moment when the left wing, as we call them today, split away from the endless discussions with Louis XVI and went into the tennis court and declared that there was going to be a revolution, and in time there would be a republic. And the person who led that was actually an astronomer, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who later became mayor of Paris. And he was actually quite a good mayor. Here he is, Bailly, the first mayor of revolutionary Paris. He still did astronomy. He looked at transits of Venus. He was quite popular in spite of this rather unkind cartoon. But unfortunately, there was a riot in 1791 where his troops shot down a number of rioters on the Champ de Mars, which is where the Eiffel Tower now stands. And poor Bailly was the first of many scientists to be executed. Okay, and he was actually guillotined. Now, in fact, Bailly was one of many scientists who believed that there were laws of progress, scientific laws of progress in human affairs. And many of them thought that the revolution, a revolution, was inevitable. in the same way as there were laws of physics which would predict the future. Then there were laws of society, scientific laws of society, which would predict the future of human affairs. And here's just a few of them. The politics of science. Lamarck, the famous biologist, there is an urge to improve in life. De Tracy, who was a physiologist, an expert on the visual system, invented a word which has become quite widespread, ideology. He invented that word, and he said, as you can see, ideology is part of zoology. Condorcet was a mathematician. He was murdered in prison. The laws that direct the universe are necessary and constant. Why should this be any less true for those of the intellectual and moral faculties of man? And Bailly, who was guillotined, the universal language of science will open the golden age. And in fact, that notion still pervades the French education system. Condorcet set up what became the modern French high school education system, which is, although it's rather rigid, is fairly effective. And every French 17-year-old has to pass an exam in philosophy. Here's this year's question, okay? De Tocqueville wrote that dogmatic beliefs are more or less numerous according to the times. Men receive, others say, no dogmatic beliefs, opinions that men receive in complete confidence and without debate. Discuss. I'd like to give that to a bunch of British 17-year-olds and see how they got on with it. I think the answer would be not very well. So this kind of large view of the universe and of philosophy being important is certainly very much alive today. So in 1889, the anniversary of the revolution, there was a contest as to what the French should do to celebrate the centenary of that great event. And there were various. They wanted to build a monument. There were various entries. One of which was a 300-meter tall model of a guillotine. That didn't actually win, fortunately. But what did win was this here, which is of course the Eiffel Tower. Now, the Eiffel Tower, that's it pictured in 1789. The Eiffel Tower was for 40 years the tallest building in the world, and it was built by an engineer, Gustave Eiffel, who already had built a number of railway bridges, which are magnificent things in their own right, built out of wrought iron. And his technique was not to build a bridge with huge steel girders that fought off the wind, but to build lightweight structures which allowed the wind to blow through. And the Eiffel Tower is a remarkable place. It's 300 meters high. It's very light. The weight of the air within the bounds of the Eiffel Tower is less than the weight of the wrought iron used to construct it. There are 18,000 girders there, and the base is 125 meters on every side. And if you were to melt down all the metal in the Eiffel Tower and fill the base with it, it would be 6 centimeters deep. That's all. Okay? So it's a very, very sophisticated structure indeed. It was very unpopular when it first appeared. The novelist Guy de Maupassant insisted on having lunch in its restaurant every day, or so he claimed, as that was the only place in Paris where he couldn't see the Eiffel Tower. Still, however, it's now of course very popular, and it's just celebrated its 250 millionth visitor. Okay. Now, Eiffel only had a 20-year lease on the site, but he had a plan which was to turn it into a scientific observatory and a laboratory. And he did that with great success. He did a number of observations. For example, he was an aerodynamicist, as one might imagine, and he did a number of experiments of dropping heavy weights on wires from the top, weights of different size and shape, measuring how fast they moved. Okay? And from then on, he went on to build the world's first functional wind tunnel, which is at the base of the Eiffel Tower and was used in some of the very early experiments on aircraft wings. So he did all that. So it was a working laboratory. It was the site of the first ever radio broadcast, and that became very useful in 1914 because the aerial on the top of the tower picked up a message from the German army, which was advancing on Paris, and the troops were sent out in taxis, without tipping them very well, to get out and stop the army, and that was the Battle of the Marne. So there's plenty of science that went on in the Eiffel Tower. But if you stand on the Eiffel Tower and you survey the beautiful view of Paris, and I kind of do this in the preface, you see all kinds of sites around which are actually monuments to Paris as the city of science. Now you can go on an artistic tour of Paris, you can go on a revolutionary tour of Paris, you can go on an architectural tour of Paris, but as far as I know, there are no scientific tours of the great sites in Paris which are of scientific importance. But there are dozens of them. I'll just talk about a few. Here's a famous experiment that never actually happened. Okay, this is Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment, where he's supposed to have held a kite in a thunderstorm with a wet string and a key. If it had been struck, he would certainly have been killed. There's no question of it. So he didn't do the experiment, but he wrote a book in which he mentioned that kind of experiment. It was called Experiments on Electricity Done in Philadelphia. And that book was read by Louis XV, who was the last but one monarch, and he was very interested in it, and he told some of his researchers to test out some of the ideas. And here's the world's first lightning conductor in Morbidly, which is on the west of Paris. And what they did was to put, you can see, you can put a metal spike up, and they paid an unfortunate volunteer, a dragoon, to hold a metal baton close to the spike, and sure enough, great streams of sparks moved between the two. And that was the world's first lightning conductor in Paris, not, in fact, in Philadelphia. Here's the world's first measurement of the speed of light. That too was done in Paris. It was done by a guy called Fizeau, who transmitted a powerful beam from his laboratory to a mirror on the top of the hill of Montmartre, and the beam shot out and came back again, and in front of the returning beam he span a wheel with cogs on it, and as the wheel speeded up, suddenly at one moment the returning light was blocked, which meant that the cog had come into place at just the moment the light had returned, and you could work out the speed of light from that. 100 years before, people might have imagined the speed of light had actually been measured, and it was remarkably accurate. So that's a physics experiment. Here's the Luxembourg Gardens. Had you gone there in the year of the Revolution, you would have seen only purple flowers, and those flowers are in fact the flowers of the potato. And one of the things the revolutionaries did, with the help of a guy called Parmentier, was to introduce the potato as food into France. It hadn't been used as human food, it had only been used as animal food, but Parmentier, with a great deal of difficulty, persuaded people to eat it. People didn't like to eat the potatoes. First of all, it's not mentioned in the Bible, so you don't really want to eat something which isn't mentioned in the Bible. Secondly, it grows underground, which is inconveniently close to hell. And thirdly, they had all kinds of strange beliefs about it. There's a line in Shakespeare's Merry Wives of Windsor, which Shakespearean scholars have long puzzled over, and Falstaff is there, and he persuades himself that he's persuaded two women to share his bed. And he raises his eyes to the heavens and he says, "Let the sky rain potatoes." And what does that mean? That turns on the belief in Shakespeare's time and later that potatoes were actually aphrodisiacs. Okay, I have to tell you, I've eaten lots of potatoes. I've never really noticed any real effect. But another aspect was the first survey of France, the first triangulation of any country, which set up the metric system. The metre, which is 1/10,000,000th of the distance between the North Pole and the equator, measured through Paris, and the kilogram, which is a cubic decimeter of water. So that too was done just after. One of the first acts of the revolution was to set that out. But the Eiffel Tower itself records much of that, and there are the names of many scientists, 72 of them, on the tower. Here we see, for example, Ampère, and most of all, we see somebody called Lavoisier. And the rest of my talk is going to be devoted to Lavoisier, who was really the founder of modern chemistry. He was the discoverer, or the co-discoverer, of nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. And he was, however, he was very much involved in pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary politics. And in fact, his fate gives my book its title, because he was dragged in 1793 before the tribunal, which sentenced many people to death. Well, quite why that happened, I'll explain in a moment. He was sentenced to death, and somebody very bravely shouted from the back of the room, "You cannot kill that man, he is a genius." And the judge said, "The revolution has no need for geniuses." That's the title of the book, The Fate of Revolution. So why did people hate him so much? They hated him because before he became a great scientist, he'd actually been what's called a tax farmer. Somebody who bought the right to collect taxes from the French state went out, and they agreed a sum, they went out, and anything they could collect above that sum they kept for themselves. And that led to enormous abuse. We have exactly the same system today, of course, with PFIs on hospitals, okay, for example, where it costs £40 to change a light bulb. So in the end, the hospital costs 4 or 5 times as much as it should have done. So the system is still around, although it's actually disguised in a slightly non-transparent way. So here's Lavoisier. He was a philosophe, or a scientist we call him now, who paid the price. And here he is. Here's a cartoon of him being carried by his farmers to extract taxes from the poor. And if you didn't pay your taxes, you were in trouble. You went to prison. If you really insisted, you'd be hanged. There were riots and so on. People paid all kinds of taxes. And the one they really hated most of all was called the octroi. And this was the tax which was paid, particularly in Paris, by all the goods that came into the city, all the basics of life, salt, bread, wine, had to pay a tax. And in order to gather this tax, there was a wall around Paris which you were supposed to pass through and pay the tax. But in Lavoisier's time, that wall was very leaky. It could, for example, just be a terrace of houses, so all you needed to do was to bring in something from the back door and take it out to the front door, and you wouldn't have paid the tax. So Lavoisier built a wall. And this is the 1784 wall around it's the dotted line, and there's a fragment of it which is still there. You can see it wouldn't be an easy thing to get over, let alone carrying a barrel of wine. He built the wall, and in it were a number of collection points, a number of tax offices which you had to pass through and pay. And people hated this. And in fact, on the 13th of July 1789, the first act of the revolution was to storm Lavoisier's wall and burn down most of the entry points. And there are only 2 of them now left. And the following day was, of course, the siege of the Bastille, and that's when the revolution really got going, but it was the wall that really sparked it off. So the Bastille just freed only 4 prisoners. There are only 4 prisoners in there, but it was the moment which now the French now remember. So Lavoisier is kind of forgotten as a politician, but he's very much remembered as a scientist. And this is another painting by David, which is in the Met in New York. A wonderful painting. It's said to be the best painting of glass ever made, different textures and colors of glass. His wife helped him greatly in his experiments, as we'll see in a moment. And Lavoisier did many, many striking experiments. Here's one. This is Lavoisier's famous burning glass experiment. He invented, really, the idea of elements, particles which couldn't be broken down any further. He got rid of the idea of phlogiston, that somehow there was a substance in every chemical which, when it was burned, was lost. Okay, they got rid of that idea altogether. This is a very clever experiment. What he did was to make a big double burning glass outside the Louvre and put a diamond at the focus, which is what he's doing now. And when it was opened and the sun streamed through it, of course the diamond disappeared. Carbon in its crystalline form had been combined with oxygen to make carbon dioxide, and it blew away. And of course this greatly alarmed the grand ladies who were parading through the Luxembourg Gardens at the time. But it was a proof, of course, that you could combine things in this way. And Lavoisier founded modern chemistry, but also founded modern physiology, as we call it, the modern study of the workings of the human body. And his line was, which it was radical in that day, but isn't quite correct, is that life is chemistry, that actually what happened to the diamond is what happens to us. And he did a respiration experiment, and here he is in his laboratory, in the back there, in the rear there is Madame Lavoisier taking notes. He's got a subject sitting in a chair. You can see him. His name was Seaguar, and Seaguar has got a mask on and is breathing in oxygen, which is being generated, and breathing out carbon dioxide. And indeed, Lavoisier was able to work out that there was a balance between the two. Then they made Seaguar exercise on a thing which looked a bit like a stationary bicycle that pulled up a heavy weight, and then his metabolic rate, as we would say today, went up. They measured the amount of heat generated. Lavoisier invented the calorimeter, which is an apparatus with ice in it, into which he put a guinea pig, the first person to use a guinea pig in biology, put a guinea pig and measured the respiration of the guinea pig and measured the amount of heat involved. So he published his results in the year of the revolution. The animal machine is governed by 3 types of regulators: respiration, which involves oxygen and carbon and furnishes heat; digestion, replenishes that which is lost in the lungs; and transpiration, that increases or diminishes in accordance with the necessity to carry away more or less heat. So life was indeed chemistry. Now there's a balance in that between the amount of exercise you do and the amount of energy and oxygen you need, which I'll return to in a moment. I'll just mention another unexpected fact. This is Jean-Paul Marat, who led one of the vicious groups of the post-revolutionary years, the group, in fact, which prosecuted and in the end executed Lavoisier. And Marat's famous for having been a politician. He died stabbed in his bath by Charlotte Corday. But before he was a politician, he was a scientist, and he actually lived in Britain. Here we have 2 of his papers, his book, a reprint of 2 tracts. One, an essay on gleats. Gleats, as we all know, is non-specific urethritis or venereal disease, and Marat was a doctor and was interested in treating VD, and actually was rather more successful than many of the brutal techniques then used. And secondly, he was interested in the eyes, and he stopped people using mercury, which they used to use to treat the eyes. And actually Marat got a degree from the University of St Andrews. All he had to do was to pay the university to do this, which led Dr. Johnson, the famous sage, to say the University of St Andrews gets richer by degrees, and at £9,000 a year they're still doing it, or at least the English universities are. So that was Marat. Marat's science was very strange. He developed a thing called the solar microscope, which puts sunlight through a microscope, and he persuaded himself that he could see, if you had a candle, you could see phlogiston or elemental fire being released by the candle. So he thought that this was in fact, that Lavoisier's dismissal of phlogiston was wrong, and that led him to persecute the poor old Lavoisier, and in the end to kill him. And here he is being murdered in his bath. Okay, so all right, so that's the physiology of Lavoisier. Here's one of the last 2 toll gates in the wall, La Rotonde, which is a very good and very expensive restaurant on the Canal Saint-Martin. I have actually eaten in it once, but it was too expensive to go to very often. If you eat in such places too frequently, and perhaps much cheaper places, what will happen to you? Your balance in the Lavoisier equation will change, because you'll be taking in too much energy and not losing it, okay? And what that has done in the last 30 years is lead to an epidemic of obesity. And here we have, and I'll go very quickly through these are the figures for people who are morbidly obese, and that's really obese, in the United States from 1985 until today. In 1985, plenty of states didn't have any data in them, okay, so they're white, but the warmth of the colour shows what proportion of people are morbidly obese. And only a few states had more than 10%. That was 1985. By 1990, a majority of states had more than 10%. By 1995, we're getting some states, perhaps just about almost half, about 1 in 6 are morbidly obese. By 2000, we're getting plenty of states where it's 1 in 5. By 2005, states where we're getting towards 1 in 3. By 2010, 1 in 3 or so is common, and in 2015 we've got plenty of states where it's more than 1 in 3 are morbidly obese. Okay, so that's a major health problem. It's not confined to the states. It happened in Europe too. Liberté, égalité, obesity. And what's striking both in the States and in Europe, of course, that we live in a unique moment in human history, because the rich are thin and the poor are fat. And that's a complete reversal of the historical event. So that's what happens when you unbalance the Lavoisier equation by taking in more fuel than you're able to burn. But there's the other side of that equation too. When you burn more than you can take in as fuel. And the Tour de France is an absolute exemplar of that. The Tour de France at the end circles some of the monuments of the revolution, of course. And the Tour de France began, as only in France, as a political gesture. It began in 1903 to do with the Dreyfus Affair. And many of you will know that Dreyfus was a Jewish French soldier, senior soldier, who was accused of treason, quite wrongly, was sentenced to Devil's Island. There was a huge row in France that went on for years, and the whole country split over Dreyfus. In the end, Émile Zola wrote a bitter editorial, and Dreyfus was released. But there had been a bicycle magazine. There had been a bicycle magazine, and of course cycling was getting popular then, called the Vélo. Now, one of the advertisers in that magazine was a bitter anti-Semite, an anti-Dreyfusard, but the Vélo was pro-Dreyfus. So the anti-Semite said, I'm not going to advertise with you anymore, I'm going to start my own magazine, which is going to be called The Auto. And the first act of The Auto was to have a tour, a bicycle tour around France. And the first one was enormously challenging. The first lap went from Paris to Lyon, and it took 18 hours non-stop cycling to do it. Okay. Now, from the very beginning, people began to cheat. Here's the first cheat in the Tour de France. He looks like a bit of a villain. And in fact, he took the train, and they found the train, and in fact, they found the train ticket. But he has some noble followers. Here's Lance Armstrong, of course, who was a major cheat. And in fact, people now suggest that the whole of the Tour de France is an uncontrolled experiment in pharmacology. Everybody cheats. Okay, everybody cheated. People have died through taking various drugs, and quite remarkably, the man in the iron mask was the first to isolate the morphine. Very soon after that, he isolated strychnine, and these are the kinds of drugs that have been widely used by athletes to try and improve their performance or to get rid of pain. Okay, so that's another tie with the history. Now, there's an interesting spin on this because, and I'm coming to the end of the talk now, because Kondo, who I've mentioned already, the philosopher, was actually a very forward thinker. He was particularly against the idea that you could classify people's rights by biology. He was very strongly in favour of women being able to vote, for example. And although he didn't, in the end he succeeded, women could vote. To the claim that any human group is of its essence less or more blessed with particular abilities is an attempt to make nature herself an accomplice of political inequality. Well, that's a very noble sentiment, but actually exercise, physiology, and extreme sport shows that he was wrong. And this really has placed sport, and perhaps many other things, with a dilemma. Because it turns out that people of African origin have different metabolic patterns than people of European origin. These are the overall obesity frequencies in the United States for 2010. If we just do, and as I say, the warmer the colour, the higher the proportion of obese people. So that's white, black, and Hispanics in this group. And here we have African Americans in 2010. And if you compare that with the overall, you'll see there is much more obesity in African Americans than in the population as a whole. Now, part of that, without doubt, is cultural. It's clear that African Americans are poorer, they have a worse diet, they often take less exercise, and there's more acceptance of obesity, it's said, in that group than others. But part of it is, in fact, biological, and how well you can see this, but these are the genetic risks towards obesity and diabetes in Africa versus other countries, and the black line to the right there is the African frequency, and it's quite a big effect. Africans have a different metabolic patterns for reasons we simply don't understand from us. Now, that's a problem with obesity, but actually when you're taking the other side of the Lavoisier equation and you're exercising like mad, it's actually a bit of a gift, all right? Here's where it shows it most of all. Here's the Paris Marathon, fifth biggest in the world, 42 kilometers. And it follows the end of the course of the Tour of France. And in fact, there's been a striking shift in the nature of the world's top 25 marathon runners. In the early part of the century, 50 years ago or so, almost none came from Africa. Now, almost all of them come from Africa. Okay? Now, that, without question, is partly a social thing, in that if you win one of these top marathons, you make a lot of money, and particularly if you're an African who maybe wants to buy a farm. So there's plenty of impetus from that point of view, but there's biology in there as well. There is a group called the Kalenjin, who have an extraordinary pattern of physiology. They're kind of super athletes from the word go. They live very high up in the mountains of Kenya, and they have many evolved adaptations to a low oxygen environment. Most people, most of us, if we are climbing Everest, let's say, and we have low oxygen, your body does something very odd. It shuts off the blood supply to about half the alveoli, the little absorbing surfaces in the lung, to allow the other half to work efficiently. However, the Kalenjin don't have that, so that all their alveoli work because they're constantly under low oxygen, and they've adapted to it in this way. And that's quite a big effect. So they can soak up oxygen much more efficiently, as well as metabolizing much more effectively than Westerners. They have mechanical advantage of having very long limbs, but that's important because they can lose heat very efficiently as well. And in fact, the Kalenjin represent 1/2000 of the world's population, but they're 1/5 of the top marathon runners. They live at 2,000 meters or so. Even before they're born, they're oxygen stressed, and so they generate more blood vessels to transport oxygen. They run from childhood onwards. Plenty of them run 10 miles to school and 10 miles back again. They tolerate higher body temperatures. They've got lower pain sensitivity and various other things, which means they're genetically predisposed to win in this kind of operation. So really that idea that we're all equal in extreme circumstances in the Lavoisier sense is clearly wrong. Now that doesn't mean to say the environment isn't important. It's not widely known that Mo Farah, probably the best athlete in the world, has an identical twin brother. Mo came to Britain, his brother stayed at home in Somalia and became a motor mechanic. Mo tells us that he used to race his brother, and half the time he'd win and half the time his brother would win. But of course this time now, of course, Mo would win every time. The genes haven't changed, but Mo is trained. So training is important, but genes and biology are important too. Now let's just remind ourselves of what happened to the people, Lavoisier included, at the time of the revolution. These slides, which I'm going to gallop through, are the people who are either imprisoned or executed or murdered at the time of the revolution, each one of which was a scientist, many of whom would have won Nobel Prizes today. The ones in black were merely imprisoned, the ones in red were killed, most of them guillotined. And just lots of red splashes there, and more red splashes, and a whole pile more red splashes. So it wasn't actually a rare fate for a scientist to be executed for his behavior and his beliefs. Now, strangely enough, we have nothing at all of that on this side of the channel. There are almost no examples of scientists becoming involved in politics. However, as we'll all remember, there is one. Here we have a British scientist who became a politician, posing for an election leaflet in 1951, and she worked on saponification. And saponification, as many of you will know, is treating oils with alkali to make soft soap, a very appropriate thing for a politician to do. And that is, of course, Margaret Thatcher. Okay? Now, whether or not she should have be imprisoned or be executed, I don't know. But it's kind of a statement of how extraordinary, really, the world across the Channel had been in 1789, when scientists were at the absolute centre of political life. Now, that's never happened in Britain. In many ways, I think we're fortunate in that. We're quite happy grubbing away in our own laboratories, in front of our own computer scientists. And that was summarized by that philosophy was summarized by a great predecessor of Margaret Thatcher. Scientists should be on tap and not on top. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
I have a question. What was the most interesting scientific discovery that you came across while writing this book?
The most interesting scientific discovery? Well, God, you caught me. I think there was a mathematician, many of you will know about, called Laplace. He was a mathematician and an astronomer. And he was the guy who gave us the mathematics of the universe. He worked out the way in which the solar system worked, and he was very strongly of the opinion that it was all like a gigantic clock, a machine. And Newton, who we Brits tend to think was the originator of modern astronomy, actually believed that God had designed the universe and spun it into motion, and it was proof of God's works. And in fact, Newton wrote 10 times as much about the book of God's words, the Bible, rather than the book of God's works, astronomy and gravity. Laplace solved several problems which Newton couldn't manage and persuaded himself that the whole of the universe was ordered, okay, and would be predicted, and if you knew what happened on day 1, you could be absolutely certain of what would happen on day 10,000,001. Okay, and that was actually the philosophy that was behind the revolution. When Napoleon, who himself had studied with Laplace, read Laplace's extraordinarily dense book, which is way above my head, about mathematics, Napoleon asked Laplace, why is there no mention of God in this book? And Laplace came out with my favorite phrase, which is, I have no need of that hypothesis. You don't need God, okay? But of course, the startling discovery, we now know, is of course that Laplace was completely wrong. The universe is chaotic. Big Bang, black holes, all that stuff. We can't predict anything. And amazingly enough, the discovery of that chaos, where was it found? It was found on the top of the Eiffel Tower in 1903. When radiation had been discovered in Paris, of course, by the Curies, and somebody had the bright idea. They had a radium source, and you could measure 300 meters away the radiation, and it just declined with distance, as we all know, the square of the distance. And somebody had the bright idea, just checking, saying, what happens if we go vertically 300 meters, and what happens to the radiation source then? It turned out it declined, but it didn't decline enough. And he suggested, it was a priest who did it actually, he suggested that there was radiation coming in from space. And that's where cosmic rays were discovered on the top of the Eiffel Tower. He was laughed out of court, but he was right. And those cosmic rays are the crashing and banging of the chaos of the universe, which is blasting the Earth at all times. So that's another reason why it's worth visiting the Eiffel Tower. Thank you.
So do you think that quote still kind of applies to British politics at the moment, considering how funding potentially might be going with government funding and lobbying and stuff?
Well, what's very striking about the British politics at the moment, depressing though it is there are no scientists in Parliament. There was one last time. One time before there were 2. Now there's none. Okay, I think that's unfortunate. I've forgotten how many lawyers there are, 250 or something. I think we should be playing a part, but apparently we don't. We're not interested in playing a part. It's a difficult problem. I mean, science funding is being cut, but we have to remember it's not being cut as much as many other things are too. And I'm not convinced that if we were on top, that would make much difference. I mean, the only other revolution where scientists, or maybe there are 2, where scientists have played a part, was that in the Russian Revolution there was an attempt to bring scientists in, but that failed miserably because as soon as the Mensheviks, the moderates, had been ousted, then we got all this stuff like Senkoism and so on, where the politics defined what the science should be saying. And that, of course, doesn't work. And the Chinese Revolution, Chairman Mao was interested in getting scientists involved, and that didn't really work either. So I think the observation is on the 3 times it's been tried, it's failed every time. So I think we shouldn't try it again.
What was it in Paris at the time which meant that scientists became politicians? As opposed, you said that it didn't happen in England, but what was unique about Paris?
I think what did it was actually quite straightforward. It was money. Okay. Now Louis XIV had founded the Royal Academy of Sciences, okay, which had its home in the Louvre, and that was just after 1661, which is when the Royal Society in London was founded. But there was a great difference between the 2. Now, the Royal Society in London was a private gentleman's club, and the people, they were great, scientists of astonishing ability who helped found it, including Christopher Wren included, and Boyle and all these people. But they joined the club, which they paid to belong to. And I say with a certain amount of shame that I'm actually belong to that club myself. And every year I curse and swear when I have to pay £150 to do all this work for the Royal Society. Whereas in Paris it was the other way around. What happened in the Royal Academy of Sciences, if you were elected to the Royal Academy of Sciences, you were paid a very generous salary. So, of course, that allowed plenty of people to spend their lives full-time working on science. There were no professional scientists in Britain, really until probably the 1860s, I would say. They were all either rich amateurs, like Darwin, who was extraordinarily rich, or a few of them were employed by the Royal Institution, let's say. But beyond that, they were all dilettantes. Whereas in Paris, they had this scientific class. And I think that had a lot to do with it.
I was interested in what you thought about the kind of the balance between politics and science, and how much scientists have sort of removed themselves from politics, to the extent that when we have, for instance, medical research, we might scientists often now will kind of correct for confounding factors which are probably political. So they'll say, okay, let's strip out the effect of this poverty, whatever it is, and produce recommendations which are about, changes that the individual can make. It has a profound political effect if all of scientist recommendations are all about, what are the things that we do that when we strip out those effects, rather than make perhaps easier to implement recommendations which are change the politics that causes those confounding factors.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, there's a long and ignoble history of science itself being used, being abused to political ends. I mean, R.A. Fisher, who was worked at University College London, who really was, as I'm sure all of you know, was a central figure in the development of modern statistics. He spent most of his career working for the tobacco industry, and he was a chain smoker himself, incidentally, saying there was no link between smoking and lung cancer, because that was correlation and not causation. Now, of course, if you want to wear your Bayesian hat, he was right. I mean, it is correlation, not causation. But the correlation is so damn strong that you really should take some notice of it. But the tobacco industry managed to stay ahead of the game by appealing to this great statistician. So science has been abused. Scientists make recommendations. They've made recommendations about sugar, for example, which simply have shown no sign of being implemented. And that obesity crisis, that obesity epidemic, is much more serious than the lung cancer epidemic, because lung cancer is a great way to go. You go to your doctor, I've got a bit of a cough. The doctor says, oh dear, don't start reading any long books, okay? Because your survival chances are low. You're not going to last very long, and you're not going to cost a lot. With type 2 diabetes, it'll probably kill you in the end. But it's going to take 15 years of increasingly expensive treatment. So it's a real problem. And yet all governments, almost without exception, have failed to act on sugar. Now, of course, people like us, we're aware of the risks, and so we behave properly. But other people aren't. I've mentioned Somalia and Mo Farah. The life expectancy average male life expectancy in Britain and Somalia. In Somalia, it's 28 years less than in Britain. And Somalia is a country torn apart by civil war, it has famines and the like. Let's go to Glasgow. The average life expectancy in the centre of Glasgow, and what used to be the Gorbals, is 28 years less for men than life expectancy in Lenzie, which is 5 miles away, which is a nice suburb. So over 5 miles in Glasgow, we've got a mortality slope equivalent to a poor African country and a rich European country. And that's because people are not being told the truth. Or maybe they are being told the truth by scientists, but that truth is being disguised from them by people who want to make money. So I think really science can only advise. It can't. I think as long as science is advisory, then it works. But once, like as in the revolution, science thinks it knows the answer because they're the scientists, then I think you get into trouble.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Oh, thank you.
That was a really good talk.